Today's daf is daf Yutes, and we're going to begin on the second line, Tana Rabbana. This part of the Gemara, until the Mishnah, is really a completion of what belongs to daf Yutes. Tana Rabbana, we learned to the Beitza, and the subject is now Tfilas Kalim during Bein HaShmashos. Bein HaShmashos is Safek Yom, Safek Laila, after Shkia before Tzeis. Klisha Nitma Be'erev Yontiv. You're not allowed to be matbil kalim in a mikvah on Yontiv. Ein matbilin also b'bein hashmashos. And on erev Yontiv, if it's already bein hashmashos, the sun is already set on erev Yontiv. It's a safek yom, safek laila. On the side that it's already laila, that means it's Yontiv. You're not allowed to be tovil. Therefore, we have to be machmir, and we have to outlaw tvila. Rav Shimon Shizuri, he's machmir v'omer, and he says, "Af bechol ein matbilin also." In general, even on a weekday, forget about the Isser of Tvila b'yontiv. Even on a weekday, we're not going to allow him to be tovel his keli during Bein HaShmashos. And why is that? Mibnei she every single kli that was contaminated, tzarech harev shemesh. The Torah says that it doesn't become Torah completely until after sunset. And therefore, if we're going to let him be matbil the kli in Bein HaShmashos, he's going to assume that Bein HaShmashos is yom, and therefore, just a few minutes later, it's already harev shemesh. He's going to use the kli b'tara, when in fact it's a suffix whether it's Torah or not, because on the tzad that Bein HaShmashos is considered Lila, then he was matbil the kli after Harev Shemesh, and he needs to wait a full 24 hours until the next Harev Shemesh. So we're not going to play any games over here. We're not going to allow him to be matbil the kli on during Bein HaShmashos and assume that he's going to wait it out a full 24 hours. We're afraid that he's going to think in his mind that he already had Harev Shemesh. So the Gemara asks the question, V'tana kama lo boy harev shemesh. What about the first Tana, before Reb Shimon Shizuri? He didn't say anything about prohibiting Tvilas Kalim Bein HaShmashos. Apparently he allowed it. It was only in the case of Yontiv, because of the Isser B'hatbalas Kalim B'Yontiv, that he prohibited during Bein HaShmashos. But in the case of Chol, he had no problem. Why not? It's a Safek Yom, Safek Laila, and we should be afraid that if we allow him to be Tovil as Kalim on Bein HaShmashos, he'll assume that when the stars come out, it's already after Harev Shemesh. Little does he know that Bein HaShmashos is Laila already, and he has to wait a full 24 hours. Why isn't the Tanna Kama worried about that? Omar Rava, Ashkachtinu l'Rabbana de Beirav. I encountered the Talmidim who are studying in the Beis Medrash, the Yasvei v'Ka'amrei, that they were sitting and presenting the following machlokes. And the machlokes here, which is a machlokes that has repercussions all over the place, but nevertheless, it's going to explain the machlokes in the Tanakam of Shimon Jazuri in our Beitza, and that is with regard to, quote, machshavto nikeres mitoch ma'asav, end of quote, kamifliki. Do we accept the principle that we can use circumstantial evidence, the way a person behaves, to indicate his machshava, his intention? Hechi domi. What's the case where, according to the Tanna Kama, against Reb Shimon Shizuri, we're going to apply this principle of machshavto nikeres mitoch ma'asav. Igon the nokit mana biyada. He's holding on to a kli, v'roit, and he's running v'azil. He's running towards the mikvah, and now it's Bein HaShmashos. Why is he running to the mikvah? Because he's holding on to the kli lat bule. He wants to be matbil the kli. So the Tanna Kama is now going to apply the principle of machshavto nikeres mitoch ma'asav. Why is the man running at the speed of light, like Flash Gordon? Because apparently he wants to get there before Ben Hashmashos. He understands very well that he needs Hariv Shemesh. And Savar, the Tanakhama, is of the opinion that Hai did Nokat, the Karoyet Viazil, the reason why he's running is made a Yada. He is a knowledgeable fellow, and he knows the boy Hariv Shemesh. He's trying desperately to get there before Hariv Shemesh, and then he realizes that the sun is set. He got there too late, but once he already made the effort, why not be Tovel the Kli in the mikveh? And we don't have to worry about such a person. He for sure will understand that the Tara of this Kli is suspended until tomorrow night with Hariv Shemesh. Whereas Umarsa, Rav Shimon Shizuri holds, no, we're not going to derive any conclusions from the fact that this man is running to the mikveh. But Machmas Malachahu Dekoroi, perhaps he's running because he's running. You know, he's got a lot of things on his list. It's Erev Sukkot, and his wife gave him a long list of things to take care of, so he's running to take care of it. And now we have to be choshesh that perhaps he'll get into a kishalon, a nichshal, and he's not going to wait till tomorrow's Bein Hashmashos and Hariv Shemesh. Rava now offers another explanation. He says, I told the Talmidim, this is what the Talmidim were telling him, but now I responded. Both the Tanakhama and Rav Shizuri are in agreement that as a general rule, we will rely on machshavta. Mitoch Masav, we will establish his machshava based on his actions. But ki pligi, the machlokas here is a different machlokas. What's the case? Why is it here that we think this person is chashud? He's not a baki, he's not an expert in the laws of Tumah V'Tara. Ki gon to itame b'pachos me'adocha, the minimum shear for a Tumah sheretz, if let's say the sheretz was cut up into pieces, the smallest segment or piece has to be ka'adasha, the size of a lentil bean. And now he comes in front of the Chachamim with a kli, and he says this utensil came in contact with a small segment of a sheretz that was pachos mikadash. And he asks the Rabbanim, itame, is it tame? Ilo, or is it not tame? So we see already that this person is not a scholar. He's not well versed in the laws of Tumah V'Tara. If he were, he would never have asked this question. This is a tiny piece of a sheretz. It's less than a kadasha. For sure, it doesn't generate tumah. Marasover, according to Rav Shimon Shizuri, midahalo gamir, the fact that he has indicated his ignorance with regard to the minimum shear of tumah sheretz is Hariv Shemesh nami lo gamir. He's probably ignorant of the halach that the Torah requires Hariv Shemesh. Umar Sovar, the Tanakhama says, Hahu de lo gamir, Hariv Shemesh gamir. Perhaps he's not aware, he's not knowledgeable about the din of tumah sheretz in a case of less than kadasha, because that's not explicit in the Torah, but Hariv Shemesh is explicit in the Torah, and that for sure he knows. And that if you open up to Vayikra, Perikid Aleph, you will see that the Torah specifies the requirement of Hariv Shemesh. The Pasuk says, V'chol asher yipol alav mehem, referring to the 8 categories of shrotzim, b'mosam, and any of them are dead shrotzim, yitama. And then the Torah says, B'mayim yuva, it should be taken into a mikvah, v'tomei ad ha'arev. So v'tomei ad ha'arev means you need Hariv Shemesh. So that's something we could assume that he knows. Now the Gemara goes back to the Mishnah to interpret a very ambiguous statement in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, quote, umat bilin migav legav umechabura lechabura. What's that all about? Taner Rabbanan, Ketzad Migav L'Gav. The Beitza asks the very same question. What does Migav L'Gav mean? Arota Lasos Ito Al-Gav Kado. So the words Al-Gav, which we'll explain, give us the Mishnah of Gav Al-Gav. So what is Gito and what is Kado? We're talking about a person who is makbil his kalim, they were kalim tmeim, and he wants to use them for olive pressing. In the old days, in order to get oil, they used to take olives and they put a gigantic stone. You've seen it maybe if you visited Beit Guvrin or any of these places, you could see the ancient olive presses, right? So they have these kalim and they were makbil the kalim for the purpose of drichas zeisim. And they want the zeisim and the shemen that they get out of the zeisim to be tahora. And now he wants to fill up his kad with shemen. So you have two things. You have gito, which means the vessels that he uses for olive pressing. And then once he's pressed the olives, he wants to take the shemen and carry them in these vessels. Now, initially, his first machshava, meaning what was sort of urgent on his agenda, was the kalim in order to do the drichas hazeisim. And in the back of his mind, maybe if we did a Freudian psychoanalysis, we come to the conclusion that he also has in mind to gather together the shemen with kalim tahor. So in this case, he now is mevakesh l'shtamish betar b'osam kalim begat, and also he has another case here of kado al gabe gito. This is a case where also kalim l'shtamish betar also kalim begat hayayin. Now we're talking about pressing grapes in order to get wine. And Toval mikvar skelu b'shtamish agatli. I'm atum vakish l'shtamish v'betar l'mili kadei shemen. So the Beitza addressed the case where now after he did the pressing of the olives, now he wants to use those same kalim tahorim for yayin, or vice versa. After he did the drichas yayin, he wants to take these kalim that are tahorim and use them for a different purpose entirely, and that is for the purpose of collecting his oil. So he goes from oil to wine, wine to oil. Osa, this is perfectly permissible. Even though the initial tvila was done for purpose X, and now he wants to use those kalim for purpose Y, he goes from shemen to yayin, yayin to shemen, doesn't matter. The kalim are tahorim. The fact that he had a machshava at the beginning that he wants to use them for one purpose, and now he wants to use them for another purpose, that doesn't in any way undermine the validity of his tvila. The kalim are tahorim. However, and let's just, before I go on, let's just point out the word gav. The word gav means no say. No say means when you have a responsibility over your shoulders. So in the old days, when they would create oil by dricha, by pressing the olives with this korah, this very large stone or beam, the beam they would use to crush the olives. And the yayin was also through dricha. Then maybe you've seen it if you're up in the Golan. They'll show you a demonstration how they used to step on top of the grapes with their feet, and they used to and the liquids inside the grapes would exude. In any event, so migav legav means minosei lenosei, meaning from one responsibility or one subject to another. And the truth is that this person who decides to do another tvila for the second purpose, that's not a tvila at all. and the Beitza allows you to do this on Yontif, what's the chiddush over here? Why would I think that it's prohibited? I mean, this is not a tefillah. The man took upon himself a chumrah shalom bin. The law doesn't require this tefillah. It's like taking kalim and putting it in your sink with water in your sink. Yeah, well, why is that awesome? So we have a number of answers to this question. The Ra'ah says that during Yontif, they were noeg tara yisera. There was a special halacha with regard to Yontif to be super careful with regard to tara because of the mitzvah aliyah l'regel and going into the mikdash. So they accepted upon themselves as a chova, a self-imposed obligation, to undergo with regard to the kelim a second tefillah, even though it's unnecessary. And once they were makabel on themselves kechova, that in the Havamim at least would upgrade the tefillah to the status of tefillah, which is also on Yontif. The Shita Beitza has another explanation that once he was machmer on himself, in his mind, he convinced himself that he can't use the kelim for the second purpose without a tefillah. So in his mind, it's like a tefillah kil chasa, which is a tikkun, and that's prohibited on Yontif. Now the Mishnah goes on and says, matbilim mechabura lechabura. Eitzad, what is chabura lechabura? And now we're going to learn a little bit about the laws of Karban Pesach. A man is eating a Karban Pesach in one chabura, and he has kelim that were tmeya before Pesach, and he was tovel his kelim, and he wants to use those kelim in this chabura. Now he changes his mind. V'rotza lechol b'chabura acheres. And that's a tricky business because once you start eating the Korban Pesach in one chabura, you're not allowed to change to another chabura. And yet, here the Mishnah is saying, Arishus biyado. He's allowed to eat with the second chabura. And he doesn't need to be tovil his kelim a second time around. And that's called matbilin michabura lechabura. Now, why is he allowed to switch chaburos? So Rashi explains, Horishus biyado, Shemedubar, we're talking about chaburos hanimnos al Korban Pesach. That apparently he had a minui, and there were minuyim, they had registered on both these chaburos. Now, Ketzad mutar lahachlif chaburasa b'leil Pesach. Once the shechita, the Korban Pesach, was completed, then he cannot be registered on a different Korban Pesach. That's a sugya in Psachim on Daf Peites. He can only change from one chabura to another chabura before the shechita, the Korban Pesach. Here it's after the shechita. So the answer is medubar li achar shekvar ochal kizayis mea Pesach. He was money on one chabura. He ate a full kizayis' worth of Korban Pesach in that chabura. He was yotzei the mitzvah. Oz rashoy limshok yado. He can now remove himself from one chabura. V'lechol b'chabura acheres. And if a person is nimlach and he wants to join a second chabura, not only can he do so before the shechita, but even after the shechita, provided that he ate already a kizayis of Pesach. Now, when he gets the second chabura, he carries with him his kelim, their kelim tahorim. There's no need to be matfil them. And he went ahead and he decided that he wants to be matfil them. He wants to be machmir on himself, shalok yedin, and to be matfil l'shem achila b'chabura shniya, meaning that your tevilah has to be done specifically with the intention for X, which was to eat it in one chabur. Now, if he wants to eat it in another chabura, he came to the conclusion that he has to be strict about it, and he didn't have the original intention in the tevilah for the second chabura, therefore he needs another tevilah. That's not a tevilah kedin. The halacha doesn't recognize that as such as a tefillah, and therefore it's not prohibited on Yom Tov. Okay, my friends, now we get to the Mishnah, which is the main subject of our learning today. The background to this Mishnah is that on each one of Sholosh Regalim, it's so exciting that we're learning this Erev Sukkos, there are 3 karbanos for each one of the Regalim that have to be brought. One is called Olas Re'iyah. The Torah says, Lo Yirah Panei Reikam, that when you come in Aliyah L'Regel to fulfill that mitzvah, you have to bring a carbon Olah. That's called an Olas Re'iyah. In addition to that, there are what's called Shalmei Chagiga, and there's an entire Masechta called Masechta Chagiga that deal with these karbanos that are shlomim. Shlomim means that the basar, at least part of the basar, is eaten by the bailim, who are not even Kohen. And we have Shalmei Simcha. Now, these are derived from in the Gemara and Chagiga on Tavav from various psukim. Olas Re'iyah is derived in Parshas Kitisa. Sholosh Pam Bashani Yeruah calls Churchas Pnei Adon Hashem. And what does Yeruah mean? The Torah says, Lo Yeruah Panei Reikon. You can't go into the Azara without a carbon, so you bring a carbon Olah. That's called Olas Re'iyah. Number 2, we have Shalmei Chagiga. And here we fast forward to Parshas Re'eh in Sefer Dvarim. It says, Shivas Yomim Tachug L'Hashem Elokecha. And we're going to come back to this pasuk over and over again. Shivas Yomim Tachug L'Hashem Elokecha. We should bring a carbon shlomim, and that's called Shalmei Chagiga. Later on, in the same parsha, it says, V'samachta b'chagecha. It's even earlier in the parsha. Anyway, Samachta b'chagecha. And the Gemara Chagiga says that Simcha is Hakrovas Shlomim. These are Shlomim that are brought in addition to Shalmei Chagiga, the Shalmei Simcha. And the question is, are we going to bring these 3 karbanos on Yontif? And intuitively, we would say yes, because Yontif generates these 3 karbanos. However, there's going to be a machlokas now between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai about Olas Re'iyah. Beis Hillel classifies Olas Re'iyah as a carbon of the regel, and therefore a carbon of the regel is brought on the regel. That's what the Torah is commanding us. And Beis Shammai is going to say, no. Wait until Chol HaMoed. There's no rush. Then it's going to be another machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. I'm saying this all as an introduction. And that is as far as smicha is concerned. And the question is whether or not we do smicha on Yontif. And smicha means that you have to lean your entire weight, the entire weight of your body on the head of the carbon, on a behemoth, which normally would be prohibited on Yontif. They still are going to say we're going to permit it for the sake of these karbanos that are generated by the regel, these 3 categories. And Beis Shammai say, no. You do the smicha before Yontif, and then you bring the carbon on Yontif. In the cases of Shalmei Chagig and Shalmei Simcha. And again, Beit Shammai, they totally reject Olas Re'iyah because the Torah says, nefesh hu levadi yosei lachem. So that's the heter of Ochel Nefesh. You can do malacha for your Ochel Nefesh, lachem v'lo l'gavah, but not for the sake of the carbon. That doesn't override Yontif. That's Beit Shammai. And Beis Hillel say no. If it's a carbon of Yontif, then Torah commanded me, Lo Yirah L'Panei Reikam, you have to bring an Olas Re'iyah on Yontif, and therefore it overrides Yontif. And Beis Hillel say once you override Yontif because the Torah generated a status of karbanas regel, then you already do smicha. Smicha is included; it's a package deal. So let's read the Mishnah. Ikchamai omrim meviim shlomim. We bring shlomim on Yontif, and that's not a problem. Why? Because we have a mitzvah to eat basar on Yontif, and that mitzvah could be fulfilled either with basar chulin or with basar kachir. And if we're talking about shlomim, the meat of which is eaten by the bailim, then that's ochel nefesh. There's no reason to prohibit the shchita, and for that matter, the akrava of karban shlomim. However, ain't somchen alim. You should have done the smicha on erev yontif, because, and here we have Rashi Shita, that smicha is called shimush bibehema, which is also on yontif. The Gemara establishes later on in Masechet the Beitza that ain't rochvin al behema, you're not allowed to ride an animal on yontif. Any sort of benefit you get from the animal is prohibited on yontif, and smicha, where you put your entire body and lean your weight on the head of the animal, that is considered shimush bibali chayim, and it's asur. And therefore, there's no reason in the world why you have to do the smicha on yontif. You could have done it on erev yontif. Now Beis Hillel add another halacha of a low olos. There is no carbon olah that can be brought on yontif, and the reason for that is because there's no achilas basar al yidei adam in the case of olah. Ola's kulo kolil is completely burnt on the mizbeach, and the Torah says ochel nefesh yasa lachem v'lo legavah. So a carbon does not override yontif in the case of an olah. However, the exception is going to be the shlomim, because shlomim is nechal bailim, and therefore it's considered ochel nefesh. Beis Hillel meviim shlomim v'olos v'somchen aleim. So here Beis Hillel disagree with Beit Shammai on two counts, a double machlokes. Number one, not only can you bring a carbon shlomim on yontif, but you bring the olah. Again, which olah are we talking about? You have to be very careful. We're not talking about a voluntary olah, what's called a neder or nedava. We're talking about an olas re'iyah, which is generated as an obligation by yontif. And Beis Hillel says it overrides the yontif. And not only that, Beis Hillel disagree with Beit Shammai on another count as far as smicha is concerned. And they're going to allow smicha. Nay, they will require smicha on yontif in all these three categories of korbanos that are brought on yontif. And the Gemara is going to explain this preview of coming attractions that the machlokas is whether smicha has to be samach l'shchita. Beis Hillel hold that smicha has to take place immediately prior to shchita. Shchita of the carbon follows immediately after smicha. So you can't do the smicha on erev yontif, and then 12 hours later do the shchita of the carbon during the day of yontif. And therefore, smicha together with shchita is a package deal, and it overrides the yontif. And Beit Shammai hold no, that there's no requirement to samach with smicha shchita. Smicha is an independent mitzvah unto itself, and then shchita is the akrava carbon is a separate independent mitzvah, and therefore the smicha could take place on erev yom. Gemara now is going to quote a machlokas between Ula and Rav Yosef about this machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. The main issue, again by way of introduction, is the status of nidarim unidavos. What would Beis Hillel, who are more lenient, say about a voluntary carbon shlomim? Can I bring it or can I not bring it on yontif? Or for that matter, voluntary carbon olah. So far, we only saw that Beis Hillel permitted olas re'iyah, which is an obligatory olah generated by yontif. But nidar and nidavas, there's no urgency to override the yontif. Omar ula machlokes b'shalmei chagiga lisma. The question about Shalmei Chagiga is whether or not you do smicha on Erev Yontif or on Yontif when you makriv the Korban Chagiga. Now there's another machlokes, the Olas Re'iyah. What is the status of Hakrava Likarev to Beit Shammai Savri? That Beit Shammai are going to exclude Olas Re'iyah on Yontif. And why is that? Because in the pasuk of Shalmei Chagiga in Parshas Emor, the Torah says v'chagosem oso chag lashem. Why the emphasis on the word chag? The word chag here is redundant, and it's coming to tell you that dafka korban chagiga you're allowed to be makriv on yontiv of korban chagiga, but olas riyah lo. The Torah did not permit being makriv olas riyah on yontiv. That's the sheet of Beit Shammai. Ubeisil Savri, let's read the pasuk again. Says Beisil, the pasuk says v'chagosem also chag lashem. Why did the Torah add the word lashem? Lashem l'rabos kol de lashem. Anything that's for Hashem, and that includes karban olas re'iyah, because that's the tzarach kavod and it's mutar on yont. Avol nidarim unidavos. This is the punchline of Ula. So you might want to underline these words, because we'll soon see that the Gemara is going to spend an entire sugya to perhaps reject Ula, and that is about nidarim unidavos. Divrei hakol ain't craven beyond it. I don't even care if you're talking about a shlomim, which is nechal abaylan, but it's a neder and it's a nedava. Why is it time sensitive? Bring it after Yontif. And even Beis Hillel, who are more lenient, both with regard to smicha on Yontif, in those three korbanos and olos re'iyah, they would agree that we're talking about a korban that is generated by Yontif. The obligation is a Yontif obligation, those three categories of korbanos, but not nidarim and nidamas. That's l'tzor kavah, and the Torah says lachem v'lo l'gavah. The Cheno or Rav Ada or Rav agreeing with Ula, and the Dar and the Dovas ain't craving beyond the Divrei Hakol. Everybody agrees, even Beis Hillel. So the machlokes here about Shalmei Chagiga and Olas Re'iyah, Shalmei Chagiga with regard to Smicha, Olas Re'iyah about the Hakrav itself, that has no bearing on the Dar and the Dovas, neither of Shlomim, nor for sure of Olos. At least in the case of Shlomim, the Basar is Nechal. So one could have argued that that's considered Ochel Nefesh. And the Kamashmal it is that no, the Hakrav itself is prohibited, Lachem v'lo l'gavah, and bring it after Yontif. There's no urgency. So that's the Shita of Ula, and Rav Ada bar Rav agrees to Ula. That on Nidarim and Nidavos, even they still agree, whether it's Shlomim or also, it's Mutter, it's Asur, it has to be postponed until after Yontif. Mason. And now the Gemara is going to quote a brayso of Shimon ben Elazar to disprove the thesis of Ula. Lo nechlaku Beit Shammai Beis Hillel al Ola she'ena shel Yontif. In other words, an Olas neder unidava, a voluntary Ola, which is not in any way engendered and generated by Yontif, is awesome. She'ena craven b'Yontif because, number one, there's no Achilus Adam, it's Kulo Kolil, and number two, what's urgent about it? Just postpone it till after Yontif. Furthermore, Al Shlomim Shein Shel Yontif, She'craven b'Yontif. Everybody, even Beis Shammai, agree that with regard to Shalmei Chagiga, Shalmei Simcha, they are certainly brought on Yontif. And that's because they have two miles, two pluses. Number one, Tachilas Adam, and number two, it's time sensitive. It's generated by the Yontif. That's Simchas Yontif, which generates the carbon of Shalmei Simcha, and of course, we have the Chagiga of Yontif. Al man nechleku al ola shehi shel Yontif. That's the olas re'iyah. That's number one. Val shlomim she'enam shel Yontif. which means nidarim unidavos of a carbon shlamim. Beit Shammai Yavi, Beis Hillel Omrim Yavi. Let's start with Beis Hillel. We understand Beis Hillel very well. Beis Hillel is saying that the basar is nechal, it's a carbon shlamim. All right, it's a neder and a dove. It's not time sensitive. But so what? The Torah says that you're allowed to do malach on yantiv l'tzarech hafal nefesh. This l'tzarech hafal nefesh eats the basar. And Beit Shammai say no, it's a carbon. Fundamentally, it's a carbon. It's true that the basar, or part of the basar, I should say, is nechal l'bailim, but that doesn't mean that it's lachem. It's not really lachem. The primary motivation for bringing this, shechting it, etc., is lashem, and the Torah only allows you lachem. But now it comes out explicitly from Rav Shimon ben Elazar that with regard to Shalmei Nedarim and Nedavos, Beis Hillel hold you could be makriv them on Yantif. And the reason why, because the Nechal Abailim, the Basar is Nechal, therefore it's Lachem. And this is against Ula, who claims that with regard to Nedarim and Nedavos, since they're not time sensitive and they're not generated by the Yantif, even Beis Hillel would agree, there was never a debate about it, it's universal, that they don't override the Yantif. So because of this kash on Ula, the Gemara feels compelled to change the girsa in the Beitza of Rav Shimon ben Elazar. Tritz v'yei mahachi. Here's how you have to rewrite the text. It always occurred to me, if let's say you're in front of a court, and the judges and the jury, they quote the books, they condemn you. Just rewrite the books. I mean, that's always the easy way out. You have a Beitza, and you don't know what to do with the Beitza, just rewrite the text. And here's how we're going to rewrite it. Omar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, lo nechleku Beit Shammai Beis Hillel al ola u'shlamim she'eno shel yantiv. And now we're talking about a neder or an adava of a carbon shlamim. And according to this reformulation of the text, the Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, ain't craven b'yantiv. These are not generated by yantiv, and therefore they don't override the yantiv. And al shlomim sheheim shel yantiv, everybody agrees, even Beit Shammai, craven b'yantiv. Al ma nechluku al ola shehi shel yantiv. The machlokus is only about ola sre'iyah. Beit Shammai omrim lo yavi, u'Beis Hillel omrim yavi. So Rav Yosef says the following. Are you so desperate to defend Ula that you're going to rewrite the text of the Beitza? Tanoi shakles me'alma? Are you totally oblivious to all the Tanoim that ever lived on the face of the globe? Meaning, we're going to find a Tana who holds like Ula. And if your Tana here, the way you have the original text of the Beitza of Shimon ben Elazar, is even Beis Hillel agree, that Beis Hillel disagree with regard to with regard to a neder or a nadav of shlamim, okay, so don't get so upset about it. You don't have to rewrite the text. Ula has a great Tana, and he stands on the shoulders of another Tana. Tanoi. The entire issue about nedarim unidavas of shlamim on Yontif is machlokas Tanoim. The Sanya, we went to the Beitza, shlamim aboy machmas Yontif. You have Shalmei Chagiga or Shalmei Simcha, which are generated by the Yontif. The Chiyuv is a Yontif Chiyuv. Is Beit Shammai Omrim Somech Aleim Erev Yontif v'Sholchatam b'Yontif, or Beis Hillel Omrim Somech Aleim b'Yontif v'Sholchatam b'Yontif. So we have a machlokas as to whether or not we require smicha karav l'shchita, and that's a machlokas tanoim. And now we're going to continue with the rest of this Beitza and discuss nedarim unidav.